So let's pick up on another disaster now. This is the Oaks disaster, which is the worst coal mining incident or accident in Yorkshire. It happened on the 12th of December 1866. 361 men and boys were killed in a double explosion at this pit, about half a mile southeast of Barnsley town centre. It was Britain's second most disastrous explosion in Britain. There was one in Wales in 1913 that killed 439 men and boys. The pit had been sunk here in the 1830s, and you can say it was no stranger to methane or fire damp explosions. 4 miners had been killed in 1945 and a further 73 in 1847. The colliery was about 850 feet deep, and there's around about 60 miles of tunnels underneath there. And that was a problem with a lot of these collieries, is they set off near enough as surface workings, but with the advantage of greater pumps and other technology, they could go deeper and deeper. They were working on a seam 8 feet deep at that depth. So this is on a Wednesday. 340 miners were underground when at 1:20 in the afternoon, an explosion took place that blew out the cages from the 2 shafts that went down, and blew out, as part of that, all the air in the mine as well. The earth shook for 3 miles around. So new cages were lowered, I guess baskets on bits of rope, I guess, by the colliery owner. As I mentioned, all these mines were private at the time. This was a Mr. Dymore who owned this, and he was able to, in that first sort of hour, bring up 20 miners alive. Unfortunately, 14 of those later died as well. And other men were rescued. But they were hampered, as you can see from this picture from the Illustrated London News, by the sheer amount of people who came to watch to see what was going on. And further rescue parties were sent down there, but all these tunnels were blocked by fallen debris and other things. And but the following morning, on the Thursday at 9:05 in the morning, another explosion ripped through the mine, and a third at 7:40 p.m. that evening, when another rescue party was down there, including the chief engineer, were killed. And again, it took out anything they'd put at the top of the shafts as well, all the sort of headgear around there. Friday the 14th, 2 men were lowered in a basket, and they just found 1 man alive down there, and from the previous day's rescue party that had been sent down, and he was the last person to be brought out alive from down that mine. The seams were on fire, more explosions took place, and eventually on the 15th, the following day, is that decided to cap the whole of the mine shafts and let to stop the air getting down to fuel that fire. And that was sealed on the 5th of November the following year in 1867. And that was really the end of the Oaks colliery. But it didn't stop other people, as we'll see a little later on, sinking mine shafts as well in the immediate area around that to gain the seams down there. Because by October 1870, all the bodies had been recovered, and that's why it was sealed after that. And again, is that adjacent mines were sunk after that. And there's a memorial to those men. This is just as you're going from the road, from the centre of Barnsley down to the Dearne Valley. It stands about, I'm going to say, half a mile outside of it. It's sort of adjacent to where the Oaks mine was. And if you know that area, and it goes down towards the Stairfoot roundabout, so that's a roundabout where you can go onto the Doncaster Road or go straight down the lower Dearne Valley, or indeed turn left, and it takes you up to Monkbretton Priory. So it stands roughly, people know where I am, the Slazenger where the Slazenger factory was that made, was it tennis rackets or tennis balls? I can't remember, but it stands on the brow of a hill there. Very easy to pass in a car, but that's where the monument is to those men who died down the pit. So this was, coming into the advent of the very deep pits around here. In 1880, there were about 475 mines at this time. There were a lot more earlier than that, but these were, because say, small mine workings that were very easily and quickly worked out. And so these were all sort of various sizes and, because say, all privately owned. And because say, coal was a large industry, but it wasn't the massive industry as we sort of know it from the 20th century. And even in Barnsley is that the linen industry was much a bigger employer of people than the mining industry was. And it really wasn't until 1912 is that the colliery industry employing miners was bigger than the linen industry. And but that year is that they were digging out 73 million tons of coal in Yorkshire. So it had grown appreciably, and because these deep mines really coming in at the turn of the century and employing around about 100,000 men at that time. And because working conditions remained under the spotlight due to the continuous deaths right across the coalfields in smaller accidents and things like that. And this led to the formation of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain that gained 600,000 members by 1908. The federation became the National Union of Mine Workers in 1945. Again, it led to a number of strikes. Those in 1912, again, at a time of trade depression, and they always seem to take advantage of that, is that it led really to the country to a standstill. Factories didn't have enough coal to fire their boilers, and again, trains didn't run, nor did trams because of the domestic coal running out as well. The strike lasted for 37 days with around, because of those 100,000 miners taking part in that. The government actually gave in on this in this time, and they set a minimum wage for the industry with the Coal Mines Act. And again, we have a change in sort of transportation. I've mentioned about the canals and the railways. And again, it came down to the canals really at this time. And these were the introduction of the Tom Puddings. These were trains of boats that were pulled by a tug, which meant they could go from power station, or they can go from coal mine to coal mine, deliver off at power stations or elsewhere.
When the streets are still empty, for the day starts to dawn, to earn me bread on the waterways. For the past 20 years, that's how I've spent me days.
I went to be an apprentice at Gold Shipyard, and I didn't particularly like it. So I didn't stop there very long, and a friend of mine worked on the barges, and I went with him, and I went to start working on barges with him for about 3 years, something like that. Then unfortunately they called me up into forces as a national serviceman. Then when I came out, I went back on the barges again. After a while I had my family, kids growing up, and one of the girls wanted to go to university and all that, so I had to change that job. It wasn't enough money. So then I went to what they call a shipping company, which taking coal to all your lie sites and all over Scunthorpe, taking coal by barge. Then after that, I left there and I came on to Tom Puddings, which was about the best paid job around here in them days. Got a job at Puddings, you were well off, yeah.
The thing was, it was paid by tonnage rates. You got a small basic rate, but your money was earned on the tonnage. You were paid by tonnage. So I think it was the skipper and the engineer used to get 11 40ths, and the mate and the fireman got 9 40ths for what the trip made.
When I first started, though, there was roughly about 1,300 compartment boats, as they were called, or Tom Puddings, and there was 13 tugs. And coal at that time was about one of the biggest, it was the biggest inland port for exporting and importing. And coal was 90% of it, I think, at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, yeah. A tom pudding is basically a steel box. Well, it's like a barge, actually. But we used to pull them up to the pits to be loaded. We used to bring them back to Gould to be discharged via an hoist into a ship.
They called the chap that invented them Tom Bartholomew. So therefore they got the word Tom, and the pans looked like pudding tins. So it's Tom puddings. We never called them Tom puddings, we always called them pans. But we always called these, funny enough, pudding tugs. There was the pans when he was in conversation, but these were pudding tugs.
Yeah, that's true. When we came from the collieries, we used to drop them in these tiers, and then you'd get a guy come aboard and he used to sort them out for different ships, you know, depending on what types of coal they wanted. Because they're all different types. You got smalls, large coal, and all the rest of it, you know. So, and then you'd pick up on the way down maybe 2 or 3 different pits, you know, maybe 2 or 3 pans at a pit, and probably top up at Castleford on your last amount of pans, maybe 6 or 7, you know. And yeah. Well, what had happened from here, as I say, there was from these lay-bys. Then the coal foreman used to come aboard and check all the pans, get all the numbers what he wanted for shipment. Then the shunt tug would come down, pick them all up and take them to the different hoists. The pans was lifted out by, you see the hoist down there? That used to lift them out of the water and then tip them.
Every time it lifted, that was a 40-ton lift, a 10-ton pan, and there was a 70-ton lift every time it pulled it, and that's fueled by water, purely water, compressed.
Yeah.
So it was unique in every sense. There was no other system anywhere in the world like it.
And it used to go down the chute into the ship's hold. A lot of it used to go down south in London River, you know, to the power stations, gas houses and stuff like that, you know. And of course you got a lot of house coal, which would go probably Poole, Shoreham and all them places, like, you know. Once there was tips, then the empties would be collected by the shunt tug again, brought to same as where we are now. Used to moor a lot here. And then in the morning, early hours of the morning, we'd come along with the colliery tugs, pick them up, you know, 17s, 19s, whatever we wanted, then take them to the collieries where we'd been ordered to go.
There was always company, because in them days there's loads and loads of hundreds of barges running about at the same time. You never was anywhere in any stretch of canal on your own at any one time. There was always a barge somewhere, or 2 or 3 barges. And at that particular time, Arcus had a fleet of petrol tankers, as high as about 90 petrol tankers. Then there were other petrol companies. All these things across here were all ex-petrol barges.
Yeah. The thing was, we'd be coming down maybe, I've seen us coming down early hours of the morning, and we've passed as many as 21 tankers coming up in early hours of the morning.
Right at the beginning of the 1800s, where they started making coal gas, or town gas as it's known. Production first started of this in 1804 at the Bolton and Watts factory in Birmingham, and that was then lit by gas. But prior to that, the actual founder of sort of the coal gas was a chap called George Dixon of Cockfield up in County Durham in 1760, when he noticed that burning coal in water gave off a gas, and in 1779 he lit his house. It's also claimed that Scottish engineer William Murdoch claims to be the first when he lit his house in Cornwall, but that actually wasn't until 1792, really 13 years after George Dixon had done that. But unfortunately, it's hard to reclaim a title when somebody else has claimed it. So George Dixon had already mixed coal with water to create tar. And this tar was used to caulk ships, the wooden ships that had been made on Tyneside at the time. And then next he lit his mine office from methane underground in 1810. And he decided to light the coal mine as too in this way, but that resulted in it blowing up. In 1817, just rolling on a few years, the first of town gas to be manufactured in Yorkshire was surprisingly at Richmond, and that was to produce gas to light the streets around there. and then it sort of spread from them to other places like Knaresborough, and then the major cities as well after that. The gasworks in Richmond stood by the side of the river where the weir is, beneath the castle, really. And because there still remains of it down there, because it wasn't demolished until the late 1950s, really when natural North Sea gas started to come in there as well. And because it's really a seating area around there at the moment. And there is a plaque down there to the gasworks being down there. But really from the 1820s, I would say, until the late 1950s, is that gas was always made from coal in this way. And because it led to a lot of the deep mines, because they providing that coal as well. And really every town had to have its own gasworks, even where and here in Horsett is down by the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. Naturally, at Rodley, there was a huge gasworks that stood down there. I don't think that was decommissioned until, or raised until the 1980s, left behind a lot of dangerous minerals as well. So have spent about £1 million clearing that in the 1990s. And so that the best coal that would make the gas was the very bituminous coal, and that really did come from the deep mines of South Yorkshire. You say I mentioned that the Oaks pit there, the seam there was 8 feet deep. Other seams are 15 foot or more as well. But these gasworks spewed out noxious smoke, and alongside the other factories that was left, obviously the engines from the mills and other works around there. And that led to those great smogs in the 1950s due to the production of that. Using burning coal gas, because it was it was sort of it was a steam that let off it from out of the coal that really went into retorts and things like that, and then they created the gas to light the streets. But there were sort of two byproducts left at the end. The coal, which you could say had been basically steamed, left behind coke, and the other one, the byproduct left behind, I guess, in the retorts and other things like that, was tar as well. And so coke burns with, because they doesn't have the sulfurous flame, because obviously that's been driven out at the gasworks to do that. And because it was then used in the iron and steel industries, largely because it left very few impurities behind as well. So that's where really the coal was reused again as coke. So that's what coke was. And then an advance on this, as we can see here, this is a picture of the Bolsover coal light plant in Derbyshire. And again, this was sort of converted into sort of coal oil at this plant, and this was sort of by burning sort of coal and coke in airtight ovens, and because the gases that came off that lit the ovens there as well. And this sort of coal oil produced at coal light was sort of used into two byproducts as well. It could be made into fuel from the gas oil, and that was used by the RAF and by the Army in World War II for fighter aircraft and tanks and things like that. So it wasn't petrol that we're using at that time from oil. And the other one was that the other byproduct left behind in the ovens was smokeless fuel, which went on to the domestic market. It doesn't burn as hot as coal, and it leaves behind a lot more sort of powdery ash. And so that was the sort of difference between it. There are a number of these plants in Yorkshire. There's one at Rossington near Doncaster, at Grimethorpe, just sort of northeast of Barnsley, and at Asken as well. And that was opened in 1929 by the first MP of the time, Jenny Lee, the youngest female MP at the time. And they were producing lots and lots of this. As you can see from this picture, it left behind lots of byproduct and things like that. They were burning 180,000 tons of coal again. So again, it was a very, very, even though it left behind smokeless fuel in the immediate area, because these were very filthy, smoky plants as well. Its main plant of Bolsover, this one here, eventually closed in 2004. So coal was also used to generate electricity, and street lighting really came in the about 1881, and the coal being burnt then to turn the turbines that created the electricity through the steam turbines that was introduced in 1884. And again, coal had to fire the boilers to produce the steam. And we see that these power stations were then built close to the sources of coal. And really, if you drew a line along the M62, is there a large number of power stations on there? I think they once call it sort of the powerhouse of Britain. I think at one time it was producing sort of 30% of Britain's electricity needs. So we're looking at sort of power station like the one that was at Elland using the Halifax type stuff from the pits around there. And then there really the three main ones coming down after that: Ferry Bridge, of course, near the Castleford pits, Eggborough as well near the Selby pits, and Drax a little further on, Drax being Europe's largest coal-fired power station. And because now most of those have either been demolished or they've been converted into burning renewables. I don't know how sort of climate change that is, because some of these renewables, or the wood and wood pulp and whatever it is transported across from Canada and other places like that. And so really we see that coal was everywhere, driving sort of power right across Britain, and really led to the golden age of it. And really sort of before World War One, it was the demand for it was increasing 4 to 5% every year. And so we have these openings of these deep coal mines. And as I mentioned before, we looked at sort of Elsica as being a sort of model pit village. But now they threw up these towns around the pit heads, and because they really transformed them as well, and often in quite bleak locations. The Thorn Colliery, that's right at the edge of sort of Hatfield Chase or Hatfield Moor, around there. It's about a mile and a half north of the town of Thorn. And actually, although it's called Thorn Colliery, the actual community around it was called Moor Ends. And basically, it was the furthest mine east. There's a lot of problems with this mine, and because they sunk the shaft in 1909, because it's right at the very, very edge of Hatfield Chase. Is that if you today you can actually walk onto Thorn Moors beyond it. These are the great vast peat wetlands that they've been restoring for the past 10 years. And really that was a problem they had, was the amount of water coming into the pit. So it sunk in 1909, but that didn't go into production until 1926. But they really threw terrace houses up, row after row of those on a grid. And if you go down there, and that's what you see today. And they're also notable as well for the giant drinking pubs as well that they have. You say probably where the fights broke out on Fridays and Saturday nights. And here, as I've shown before, is the lovely town of Asken, as it was pre-1911. It was a spa town where visitors came and they took the treatments in the hotel, and there were bathing houses and all sorts of other things around there. The pit there was sunk in 1911, and overnight it became a mining town. No visitors came to the spa facilities there anymore. And then on the further side of the pit in the 1950s, Eyestoneville, this is this place over here, was built. It's named after the last owner of Askham Main Colliery, Sir Samuel Ironstone. and he employed 3,000 people at his pit, and it was outputting by 1975 750,000 tons of coal. And again, like most mining towns, if you go to them, it is just row upon row of housing, fairly sort of dreadful housing as well. The only one that sort of had been planned was around the Brodsworth pit, maybe because that's fairly close to Brodsworth Hall, and maybe the people who own Brodsworth Hall had an income coming in from the collieries and had some sort of sway over how Brodsworth was going to look. But generally, all the towns, like I say, were properties like this, just row upon row with very few facilities. And I think that was a problem, that when they were completely based around coal, and that when the coal industry disappeared, is that it left behind all these social problems, no other jobs and things. But we'll look at that in a few minutes. So World War One is that the pits were sort of nationalised for the war effort, and then were given back to the private owners after the war in 1920. And this sort of a problem then is that it was a very short-lived golden age in 1920, but then slowly or fairly quickly slipped into recession and led to another miners' strike in 1926, a strike that lasted 9 days. And really the result of this was partly due to World War One, unusually, because before the war, Britain was exporting a lot of coal into Europe and elsewhere. And but when the sort of war broke out, we weren't obviously exporting into Germany, although they had lots of mines themselves down the Ruhr Valley. But that sort of export trade that we had stopped. But the United States started exporting their coal into Europe, and that was a sort of problem that lasted after that, and it led to sort of the coal output in Yorkshire and in Britain falling to 1.2 million tons a year after that. Like I say, from its far down from its pre-war high of that. And because in sort of 1880, we see that the production per head of miner was about 310 tons. In 1924, it had fallen to 199 tons. The price of coal fell, and like I say, it was still being undermined by in Europe itself, because a part of the war reparations is that Germany gave its raw coal to France and to Italy, and say, rather than paying out in cash. So effectively, France and Italy were getting free coal from Germany, and all this had its ramifications back into Britain. The miners, say, their hours were reduced, and say their wages were reduced as well, to try and make these pits economic. And that's really what the problem was, leading to the miners to go into striking, because they weren't earning as much, because they couldn't work as longer hours as they used to be able to. And again, Britain ground to a halt, say, with trams not running, mills closing, and say, coal being diverted away from domestic production. Again, because these were in the early months of the year where the sort of strikes have always taken place, where they'll hit the hardest. And because this strike from 1926 was still being felt in 1934, because there was disruption in supply, there were less miners working, so there was less outputted. I guess because the owners of the collieries they wanted to be a shortage of coal in Britain, that it would push prices of coal up to make their pits economic again. You could say the worst year that post 1926 was 1934, and because again the shakeout from the industry had employed 1.2 million miners at the close of the war. In 1934, just 800,000 miners were employed in the pits. So it had gone down substantially within that. But we'd also seen that there was an increase in tonnage per man. That had now gone up to 300 tons per miner. But part of that was due to new technology being being installed into the mines. Because until that period, really, everything was done by hand picks. But now, because the new engineering techniques being brought in underground, which meant that coal was much easier to get out than it had been. Because the stopping use of pit ponies and things like that, putting conveyor belts in, and then putting the very first sort of cutting equipment in onto these coal faces that really developed over the next 30 years into the sort of the mining industry that we imagined it to be. So that was really, again, we had the Second World War, and after that, when the Labour government had a landslide victory in 1945, is that the Labour government then nationalised the whole of the coal mining industry in July 1946, and this led to the running by the National Coal Board. They inherited 958 mines in Britain run by 800 different companies, and because they're employing really that same number of miners, 800,000 as well. That was at that time around about 4% of the British workforce. They started initially to close the uneconomic pits, because around about a third of those 958 mines were smaller mines. That means outputting less than 100,000 tonnes annually, whereas the 50 largest were outputting over 700,000 tonnes. So between 1947 and 1951, 101 of these pits were closed. Many of those in Yorkshire were to the west side of the M1. So that's the Huddersfield mines, the Halifax mines, and Wakefield mines as well, really leaving the deep mines of Barnsley alive. This picture here is of Wentworth Woodhouse, because Manny Shinwell, the Labour Minister for Fuel and Power, took a dislike to the gentry, and he took 110 acres of the lands around the house. So if you're looking at this picture, that's Wentworth Woodhouse frontage there, overlooking its front lawn. I think this area here is the garden centre around there, if you know sort of Wentworth Woodhouse at all. That's down here is the church, where I mentioned that when I looked at abandoned churches, because the older church is in these trees down there. So you can see the amount of land they took. They weren't sinking coal shafts down here. This was open cast mining on a giant scale. You can see here, it goes right up to the back door of the house there. They extracted 345,000 tonnes of coal. The family tried to give away the property to the National Trust in 1947. They came up and had a look, and a report said, right up to the very wall of the Vanbrugh front, every tree and shrub has been uprooted, awaiting the onslaught of the bulldozers. Where the surface has been worked, it is utter waste and chaos. Even if the National Trust wanted to take over that house at the time, is that Manny Shinwell certainly didn't want them to take it over it, and he raised objection to that, and the National Trust never gained the property at that time, and then hence the subsidence that the house has suffered ever since, being repaired at the moment in a sort of £27 million programme that's probably going to last 30 years. So that £27 million is probably today's money and not the final cost of that. Like I say, it was the sort of not only the thinner seams that sort of affected the industry, the closure of those mines, like I say, in the Wakefield, Huddersfield, Halifax area, but there was also a demand through the Clean Air Act of 1956 to stop as much power production from these coal mines, really from I think they call it the Great Stink and things like that, of London and things like that, where I say coal played its part in that process. We see the introduction of nuclear energy in 1956, and also the use of oil to power the diesel trains rather than the coal as well. And then, right at the end of the 1950s, we have that North Sea gas coming in, the sort of clear gas coming in, and it being cheaper than coal as well. So those are really the sort of 3 or 4 things that impacted on it. By 1960, There were 70 collieries in a 15-mile radius of Barnsley at that time, but all gone by 1994, roughly. But they were still remained highly productive. In 1980, the Goldthorpe mine extracted 1.2 million tons of coal. So comparing that with, you know, the 50 mines after the end of World War II, extracting 700,000 tons, is that because the coal went on relentless as well, really to fire those power stations along the M62 as well. And then we can see something like there's very few pit heads that you can see today, but this one is again south of Barnsley. So if we're talking where the Oaks Memorial is, I say, it goes down to the Stairfoot roundabout. It was once crossed by a mining railway. It's the railway that ran from the Lower Dearne Valley right across the Yorkshire Wolds to the to Hull. So that's how that was exported. You can just see the sort of the footings of that. And if you turn left there, it's at that roundabout, the first left, it takes you to where the Barnsley main pit was. Like I say, it's got all its shafting and headgear up here. A bit further on that road is say Mount Grace Priory, but it's Monk Bretton Priory as well. So they're really within a mile of one another. It is slightly difficult to find this, is because it's off a minor road that runs from there. But if you look on the map, you'll see where it is. But it's, you can see there's a little bit of a car park there, and you can see the grounds have been landscaped around there. The Oaks pit actually stood just a bit further over from these trees. So really when that was sealed and capped, the Barnsley main was then sunk, although it had been here since about 1830. But again, it was expanded to go into where the Oaks pit, where the mineral rights was for the Oaks pit around there. And so this colliery closed in 1991, but most of what you can see above surface dates from the 1950s. Because that's one of the few collieries that you can actually see in situ around. All the others have been raised and capped, especially go further down the Dearne Valley, which I'll mention in a minute. And then we had another strike in 1972, so the miners were really fairly well paid at the end of the 1950s into 1960s. They were earning round about 7.5% more than people working in manufacturing industries. But they found out that the decade went on. By 1969, their wages actually fallen by 3%, lower than those working in manufacturing industries. The mines here at this time were employing around about 500,000 people. And this miners' strike then led to the railway workers, who then refused to transport coal that was going to go to the power stations, and led to a state of emergency when power across Britain had to be reduced. I guess probably people remember having to use candles and things like that. And again, in a period of very cold weather at the beginning of 1972. This strike lasted 7 weeks and resulted in a pay offer on the 19th of February, which actually resulted in a 27% pay rise in order to counter the losses of the 1960s. It also led to the founding of that meeting called COBRA that we'd never heard of before until last year, or very rarely until last year, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room, because they established for national emergencies, because they mentioned quite a few times last year when our Prime Minister didn't turn up for a number of those. But really the result of this sort of miners' strike was the sort of reduction in the mines as well. Some of these had played out, so there wasn't. There was an economic case, is that that they were just too expensive to keep going. Around about in the mid 1970s, there were 240 deep mines employing 300,000 miners, and they were outputting 140 million tons annually. So really, like a lot of industries, it was new technology that allowed this to get more coal out than it had ever done before. And so these were sort of really sort of highly productive pits still, but it really sort of culminated to a head with a miners' strike of 1984-1985, which pitted the government against the unions. you say this sort of led to that, which we'll look at in a minute. But in the meantime, is that investment in mining hadn't stopped. It saw a future because there's this great demand still from the coal-fired power stations, and this led to the opening, as I put here, the Selby Superpit. It actually, in fact, was 6 mines. There was Wistow, Whitemoor, Stillingfleet, North Selby, and Rickle. There were the sort of 5 mines that were where the shafts were at, and there was a 6th shaft at Gascoigne Wood, and Gascoigne Wood was where all the coal from those other 5 shafts were outputted. They dug 120 miles of tunnels. These tunnels had conveyor belts leading from the coal faces and then going out at Gascoigne Wood. So Whitemoor, which is near Cliff, which is down sort of just north of Selby, that was 13 miles away from Gascoigne Wood, where the coal was actually outputted. So what you see at these other pits were really just the concrete head shafts, and really not much else around it apart from car parks, because there's no coal being brought out at these super pits, but they're all brought out at Gascoigne Wood as well. The first shafts for the Selby Superpit were really sunk in the sort of mid-1970s, and because the project costs on this were £400 million pounds at the time, and they estimated there were 600 million tons of coal in this sort of North Selby area as well. And the seams, as we can see here, this is a picture from one of them, were between 6 to 9 foot in depth. And beyond that, the 600 million tons, they thought there might be another 2,000 million tons of coal, because that's what they hadn't sort of geologically had a look at. They just looked at this area in between the pits. Production started in 1976 and it reached its peak in 1993-94 with 10 million tons being outputted. And the miners who came from here, they've employed thousands of men. They really came from the other deep mines that have been had closed during this period. That's why these mine heads had large car parks, but nothing to really else to be seen beyond the shaft itself. But by 1999, it started to operate at a loss. The following year, 2000, they made a £30 million loss that resulted in mining ending in 2004 with just 121 million tons of coal being extracted. And really, this is a time when all hopes were really on that Selby Superpit of being perhaps the last of the coal mines around here, and actually had probably a 20 or 30 year lifetime or more as they sort of ran out of reserves. But in 1984, Yorkshire just had 56 pits. Britain as a whole had 133 mines, employing 180,000 miners, outputting in total 133 million tons of coal a year. But what we see is that cheaper coal was now coming in, especially from Russia and Poland. This undercut the price of British coal, largely due to the labour costs as well. Is that I guess in Russia they're paid in just a couple of rubles, where over here miners, to say these deep miners in the Selby Superpit, were very, very well paid. And so that sort of, and this cheap coal in led to these pits becoming economic financially in a way. They couldn't compete really with the cheaper coal coming in from Russia and Poland. And the Conservative government at that time didn't want to subsidise these, what they termed uneconomic pits. And so Margaret Thatcher took on the National Union of Mine Workers, led by Arthur Scargill, who called for a national strike. It wasn't wholly supported. It was in Yorkshire, but other mining areas like Nottinghamshire and South Wales often didn't take part in this. And it sort of led to very violent clashes in Yorkshire. The most violent was on the 18th of June 1984 at the Orgreave coking plant, which is down the lower Don Valley. And it led to sort of 55 miners being charged with riot and a further 40 with unlawful assembly. But it sort of split, I think the country on two lines because a lot of the national press came out in support of the miners, which turned a lot of people's opinions against the police in that. But other people saying that if the pits are uneconomic, we can't afford to keep these mines working. And in the end, it led to the closure of all these mines and the loss of these tens of thousands of jobs as well. But it wasn't just the mining jobs that went. Unfortunately, it was all the ancillary jobs. So these were mining engineering companies, people who supported into that, the steel industry as well. So its knock-on was actually much greater than it was probably initially thought by these sudden closures of these last mines as well. It really hit the lower Don Valley in Sheffield as well, because also the engineering industry was down there as well. So it wasn't just those people, but it was the corner shops, the sandwich shops and other things like that that really decimated these communities. But we see in 1994 is that the remaining mines which are out there was sold off. They were reprivatized. One of those chaps that bought into it was Richard Budge. I think he remained sort of believed in the future of the mining industry. In fact, I met him down at Hatfield Colliery in, I think it was 2008, when he said there was a future for it by producing clean coal. There was a huge grant around from the EU for the research into clean coal, and that they said he was going to build a pipeline from Hatfield, which is stands enough next to the I'm going to say 62, but it's not, it's the M18, and produce a pipeline that would go across, and the byproducts would be to use to fill salt caverns underneath the North Sea. But that sort of came to nothing and really led to the end of an era. You could say at the sort of last count, when the last mine closed in 2015, since really 2004, there were just 16 mines operating in Britain, employing just 13,000 people and outputting 21 million tons of coal. And like I say, but Richard Budge really got his fingers stung twice. He was the last owner, as I mentioned, of Hatfield Colliery, and wanted to do the clean gas as well. That failed in 2015. And the last coal mine to close in Britain, and indeed in Yorkshire, was Kenningley near Ferry Bridge on Friday the 18th of December 2015. Because they were extracting there until that time 900 tons of coal per hour, and like I say, just 450 miners working on that, because there were 24-hour operations around there. And so we see the sort of reverberation of that with the loss of the coal mines, especially amongst these mining towns and mining communities. And I say especially probably the lower Dearne Valley, that's between Barnsley and Rotherham, where it all closed really in the mid-1980s. The government then made them into enterprise zones and sort of took over the sort of pit heads, took down the shafting and built them as sort of industrial estates around there. But unfortunately for the people down there is that the people who moved in were either screwdriver factories, i.e. putting components together, sometimes for the car industry and other things like that. And there were also sort of transportation companies that had huge sheds but employed very little people, and because these new jobs that came in, because they were very low paid compared with the mining jobs before it, and quite often, or most often, is they didn't want ex-miners working down there. They thought they were too old or didn't have the skills, and especially these screwdriver factories actually wanted to employ younger female staff for their dexterity, and probably perhaps because at that time they could pay them less as well. So there's really no jobs for the redundant miners, but there was some mining still continued in this period because of the open cast works, which doesn't sort of normally get much of a mention. There were some quite large ones in the sort of the Leeds Wakefield area, St Aidan's near Castleford, and really enough in view of Ferry Bridge, that was a huge open cast pit. The open cast mine was 250 foot deep there, because work began there in 1946, largely because it was cheaper to get out and only required sort of a huge shovel, a claw to mine that out, and that came to an end in December 2003 because about 3 million tons was taken out there a year as well. The coal from St Aidan's used to power Ferry Bridge station as well. I think I've got another photograph here, because that is called Oddball, that's at the St Aidan site. It's now an RSPB nature reserve, and that's on show there, this huge thing. It was built in Milwaukee in America and brought here in 1946. I guess it in bits because it weighed 1,220 tons, and that was really the main thing. So these open cast mines really didn't employ many people at all. There's still one that I know of which operates, which is at Sisset near Denby Dale. It's known as Clay Works, and you'd have to look at sort of Google street view or sort of aerial view to have a look at that, because it's fairly well screened. It's right next to the main road that runs down that valley, and it's on the site of a former Park pit that closed in 1989, and they extract 190,000 tons of coal there a year. But they're also looking at that byproduct, as I said right at the beginning, in sort of geologically, is that coal and clay is normally found together, and they're extracting 40,000 tons of fire clay there. That was their sort of last things I could see in the output in 2015. The coal is sold on the open market and is worth an estimated £13 million. The clay is actually taken over to Drax and is made into bricks over there. So where can you go and see more about the mining industry? I mentioned you can see that head gear out at Barnsley on the site of the Barnsley main colliery, but probably the best place to go is the National Museum of Mining. This opened in 1988 on the former site of the Cap House Colliery, a mine that had first been sunk between 1770 and 1780, and for most of its life owned by the Kay family until it was, nationalised in 1947. It closed in 1985, and most of the buildings you can see from the photograph here date from between 1876 and 1939. If you haven't been, it's free to go in, but I do heartily recommend is that you phone them or go on the internet when it does eventually reopen, because if you pre-book, it means that you can go down the mine shaft itself. You go, they kit you out, and you go in the cage. I think you go down a few hundred feet, and you then walk along the tunnels, and they've sort of displayed on there a sort of history of mining from those very first young boys and girls that opened the sort of air traps down there to really that sort of the mechanized cutting at the colliery face as well, and how it was brought back up on conveyor belts and things like that. I did have the opportunity, funnily enough, I don't know how this came about at all, because it seems quite remarkable today. In 1975, I had a school trip down a colliery somewhere near Sheffield. I did have a sort of postcard from it, and we went right down to the working face, and the difference between that and the Museum of Mining was the huge gales that were blown through those mines. That's why they had those air trap doors down there. It was absolutely phenomenal when you walked through. It was like a gale force wind down there, and the heat. And because if you go down mining museum, it's cold and damp, but in those working mines, it was absolutely incredibly hot down there as well. And how far it was really from the shaft to the coal face as well. Like I say, amazed that a school party would have been allowed down there. So that's really the difference between the sort of mining museum and actual working mine itself. And probably the other thing that we can see is the reclaiming of the coalfields as well. I've mentioned St Aidan's in 2010. That was taken over as a nature reserve, 400 hectares it covers, that opened in 2013. So I think that's the RSPB, but you have to pay to the car park to go in there. And it's a series of lakes as well around there. So that's what's filled in that open cast site, where if you come down the lower Dearne Valley, this is called Old Moor. It's not actually a mining where a mine was. That's a bit further down, where I think the industrial estates are called Manvers East and Goldthorpe, and Orgreave is now the site of the miners' strike, is now a out-of-town shopping centre. The Manvers East has a gigantic next warehouse on it. I'd say that's about half a mile long. It's absolutely ginormous. I met somebody who'd worked in there a few years ago, and they averaged walking in that warehouse 14 miles a day. That gives you an idea of the vastness of that warehouse. But just above it is RSPB Old Moor. This is really a result of subsidence from Manvers, and that's what you can see round there. These sort of lakes are down there. And up here, next to the M62, on the former site of the Glasshoughton colliery at Castleford, that closed in 1986. And really, the cost of restoring these mining sites is absolutely phenomenal. I think across the road on the Pontefract side, just across it, adjacent to the racecourse, there's still a huge mountains of material there to remove and to restore that. They tend to sort of grass them over to begin with until such a time. But it took 10 years of really more of decision making before the sort of the Glasshoughton site was cleared, and they've opened that Escape Leisure Centre. That opened in 2003. It's now got a skiing piste and other things inside of that. And of course, there's a ubiquitous Junction 32 shopping village as well next to it, as well as you can see here, a range of the typical sort of out-of-town eateries. You've got a Nando's there, you've got a Pizza Express and other things down there, a McDonald's. They're all down there as well. And so that's really sort of where we stand at the end of the mining industry, something that employed over 1 million people, but very little now to see left of it. So that brings us an end to the coal era.